Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm Susan Zeiger of Primary Source, and I want to welcome you warmly to this Primary Source online seminar on gender violence in global context, featuring Professor Elora Chowdhury of UMass Boston. I'll be introducing Professor Chowdhury in just a few moments, but first, by way of introduction, a couple of things I'd like to say. The webinar this afternoon is part of a three-part series on ways to engage young people in the U.S. in thinking about global campaigns for justice around the world and in their own country. We launched the series in February with Climate Action for Global Social Justice. And do not despair if you missed Noel Healy's truly outstanding presentation, because it's recorded and you can access it from our Primary Source YouTube channel, which you can always find by going to our homepage of our website and finding the YouTube link in the bottom right-hand corner. That's a nice shortcut for you. We finish this series next month with a webinar on children's human rights around the world. And that session will be led by a legal studies scholar from the West Coast, from Washington State, with a case study focus on South Africa and several other world locations. I should add that all three of these webinar sessions, will be available in recorded form on our resource guide for global social justice and on our YouTube channel through Primary Source. So you can share those with others and return to them yourself. We are very excited to offer this series looking at social justice issues in global context. We are very grateful to the Cummings Foundation for making this series possible with their very generous support. And I'd like to offer a special welcome to teachers who may be here with us today as part of our Cummings Grant project with the Medford, Somerville, and Woburn Public Schools here in Massachusetts. I want to welcome the rest of you as well, and thank you very much for making the time to join us this afternoon. While I'm expressing gratitude, I also want to thank my superhero colleagues here at Primary Source. Anne-Marie Gleason co-planned this series with me. Anne-Marie will be helping to monitor your questions and maybe answer some of them today in the chat box. Nabil Haq and Stephanie DePaul helped us immensely behind the scenes with research and logistics. And Stephanie DePaul is joining us online today. And our staff librarian, Karen Storrs, created our Global Social Justice online resource guide for the whole series and for this session today. So thank you to all of the wonderful people I work with. Later in the hour, we'll have a designated block of time for your questions and comments, but we do encourage you to begin entering your thoughts and questions as soon as they occur to you in the chat box, which will be found in the lower left of your computer screen, down in that chat corner. And as we're getting started, maybe I'll suggest a point of discussion. Would be really interested, Elora and I would be really interested to know how and where you're finding space for this topic in your own classroom. Has that been possible, and what's been effective with your students? So please feel free to comment on that set of questions, and we'll look forward to our interchange later on in the hour. Now a word about Primary Source. Primary Source is a not-for-profit organization that partners with educators to bring global and cultural awareness into K-12 classrooms and schools. We're not 25 years old, we're more than 25 years old. And the heart of our work is professional development that's carried out in many formats for K-12 teachers, face-to-face courses, in the summer and during the school year, online study tours, book discussion groups, and many other forms. We're a resource center for global education, and we do curriculum development and school consulting as well. Now, I'd like us next to turn our attention to our webinar topic this afternoon. Gender violence is a worldwide problem, as you all know. A problem in the United States and in all world regions. And women around the world are rising up to resist it. If we want to think about global issues or global problems with true global competence, it sometimes means that we need to take a few steps back and do a lot of listening. My definition of a problem, for example, could be different from yours, and my proposal for a solution might not be the solution that you are looking for. And there are, as we think we know, many visions of feminism and of gender equality throughout the world. Our scholar this afternoon is going to guide us through some of these multiple perspectives and help us to do that careful listening to voices of women that we don't always have an opportunity to hear in the United States. We are so pleased and proud to have with us here on site at Primary Source, Professor Elora Chowdhury. Elora Halim Chowdhury is Associate Professor and Chair of the Women's and Gender Studies Department at UMass Boston. Her research and teaching interests are wonderfully aligned with the topic of our seminar this evening. They include transnational feminism, gender violence, and human rights narratives. She is the author of the book Transnationalism Reversed: Women Organizing Against Gendered Violence in Bangladesh. We were excited to learn that that book was awarded the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize by the National Women's Studies Association in 2012. Elora's upcoming book, or forthcoming book in 2016, co-authored with Liz Philippos, is entitled Dissident Friendships, Feminism, Imperialism, and Transnational Solidarity. Several of Elora's works can be found on Primary Source's brand new resource guide, which I'll have a chance to share with you later in the seminar session. But for now, I am delighted to turn this over to Professor Elora Chowdhury. Elora will be introducing us first to a theoretical framework for thinking about gender in global terms, and then she'll go on to share some very powerful case studies about gender violence from the South Asian context. So we're looking so much forward to learning from you, Elora, and you can turn on your mic and take the podium. I think we've got you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Susan for inviting me back to Primary Source. I'm an admirer of the work that Primary Source does, so it's a real pleasure to be here for this conversation. And also a warm thank you for all the staff members, particularly Nabil Haq, who helped me put together this presentation today. So also thank you to Susan for that generous introduction. I just wanted to say that I came to this work, which is research on gender violence and human rights, through a background in community organizing, and some of the work that I will be sharing with you today comes from the many years of work that I have done in multiple spaces, including as a practitioner, as a policy person, also a researcher, independent scholar, and of course as an academic. So I hope to sort of give you an overview of these various sites from which I have participated in researching gender violence. So before I talk about the particularities of my research, as Susan mentioned, the presentation I have for you today is divided in two parts. In the first part, I'll talk a little bit about some of the conceptual frameworks that help us understand women's oppression, marginalization, gender-based violence in a global context. And in the second part of the presentation, I'll talk about some narratives or some stories about particular cases in South Asia, which can help us sort of think through what forms of violence can look like in different locations and the different kinds of activist responses to it. So while it's important to always acknowledge our location, so I have this slide for you that kind of locates my presentation today within a North American context and framing it within sort of the discipline of women's studies, which emerged out of the women's movement in the 1960s, as well as various social justice movements that were ongoing in the 60s. And the discipline of women's and gender studies is often talked about as being the academic arm of the women's movement. It has grown tremendously, obviously, in the last 4 or 5 decades, from the time that it used to address the marginality of women, the invisibility of women, and as feminist scholar Bell Hooks talked about, bringing women from margin to center. There are various ways to think about gender studies that have actually moved away from some of the earlier viewpoints. So one of the, of course, most important contributions of women's studies as a discipline has been the ways in which that it has helped us understand gender. And I talk about this at this point of the presentation because my later slides will talk about how violence against women is framed within the bodies such as United Nations and other humanitarian organizations, and how the concept gender is often seen as synonymous with women. And this sometimes leads to thinking about gender-based violence in a very essentialist sort of way. And so just to sort of broaden our thinking about it, I thought we'd spend just a minute to talking about gender as feminist scholars have talked about it in opposition to some of the earlier kinds of thinking is biology destiny, is the so-called sex-gender system that as a binary way of thinking about the physicality of sexual identity and gender as a socialization of roles. So moving away from these earlier essentialist notions, feminist scholars have talked about gender as a social construct, that it is also a relational construct, so it informs our understanding, our expectations about notions of what masculinity and femininity mean, and that these are always in relation to each other. And also that it is a concept that is constantly evolving, it's changing over time, and it varies over space. And meanings that we associate to masculinity and femininity are obviously embedded in culture. So that it's in no way sort of set in stone. So the discipline of women's studies, how has it thought about women's lives, ideas about gender, cross-culturally and in a global context? Historically, there has been, I think, 2 primary ways that women's lives in a global context have been theorized within this discipline. And one of them is what I'm calling here the essentialism or the sameness model, that this assumes that women across cultures and around the world, they share certain roles and certain experiences, such as the experience of housework, the experience of childcare, men's sexual violence, lack of access, exclusion, that women in this kind of model are seen as the other, which is that men are seen as the norm and women are seen as the other. And it is this othered experience upon which women can come together and share this common struggle that they have against patriarchy. And in one classic text in 1984 titled "Sisterhood is Global," Robin Morgan talked about this notion of women as other and how this shared model helps us understand gender-based oppression. Now, this model has been critiqued quite a bit by feminist scholars because while women might share certain experiences like housework and childcare and violence and exclusion, women in various cultural contexts don't live their lives simply as women. So we have to understand gender experience in relation to other social forces and other axes of identity, such as nationality and religion and sexuality and class, so on and so forth. So the ways in which that a middle-class white woman in the United States will experience childcare and housework would be vastly different from someone living in an urban context in India, or someone living in urban middle-class context in India. Their life would be vastly different from lower caste woman living in rural India, and the whole idea of access, inclusion, violence get complicated. So therefore this notion of sisterhood is global and that women experience violence in similar ways is sort of naive to assume. Another approach historically in women's studies scholarship to talk about global feminism has been the modernization approach. And this is sort of rooted in early Enlightenment thought. It's also sort of emerges from the scholarship and the understandings of colonization and the colonial project, where when I teach courses on gender and development, I start the premise with the European expansion worldwide in the 1400s and onwards, and how this travel to foreign territories for economic, political exploitation, conquest, territorial settlement, economic exploitation was often justified by using the language of a civilizing mission. That the Western travelers and the colonizers were bringing enlightenment and modernization to these parts of the world that were considered backward. Now, in the post-colonial world, this kind of thought system has still exists and has left some powerful legacies. And in the modernization approach of thinking about women's lives around the world, includes such thinking as the world in a binary way, that there are these first world nations and then there are the third world nations, and there are those regions in the world that have democracy and those that don't, and of course that Western and European and United States first world lifestyle is something that everybody should aspire to, that is the standard of progress and advancement and development. This whole idea of development or progress with a capital D is often premised on this kind of binary way of thinking. And this again has been criticized by various feminist scholars as being very hierarchical. And Maria Mies, in particular, a German feminist scholar, has this very interesting work called The Myth of Catching Up Development, where she talks about how the development and economic and social advancement, industrialization of one part of the world was so dependent on the exploitation of other parts of the world. So colonization, slavery, the genocide of Native Americans in the United States, all of these were the price that were paid for the so-called advancement and industrialization of first world countries, and that these kinds of divisions still impact our lives and thought systems and the ways in which we come to understand the lives of populations living outside of the so-called first world. So these are sort of the two major ways that global feminism has talked about the idea of patriarchy and women's and men's lives in sort of very dualistic ways. And I just want to add a word about this concept of women's rights or human rights, which is often used to sort of champion women's advancement, emancipation, liberation of living in the so-called developing world, comes out of this kind of sort of hierarchical thinking, because what it does is it flattens the inequality that exists in the world and assumes that that women exist in communities simply as women, but not necessarily as part of communities that have gone through some of these violent upheavals historically. And of course, that the so-called liberated and westernized world has often participated in the direct exploitation and conquest of territories which we are marking as particularly underdeveloped or backwards. So the idea of women's rights and human rights sort of flattens these kinds of asymmetrical relationships and how one part of the world may have contributed to the detriment of the rights of women in other parts of the world. So just a word about, as Susan mentioned, that I do work on the area of transnational feminism, and how has transnational feminism then theorized about, explained the whole idea of gender-based violence or women's and men's marginalization and gender-based oppression. So some of the key words to keep in mind here is that it pays attention to this colonial history and neo-colonial power relations, imperialism, and patriarchy, which is systems of women's subordination, how these are sort of influenced by the histories and legacies of colonization and imperialism. Also, it looks at gender experience in relation to other social forces like capitalism and racism and globalization, and how these intersect with one another to create certain kinds of vulnerabilities for social groups and individuals. And it also takes an approach where we look at the lives of women and men in different parts of the world as interconnected. So instead of looking at the so-called third world as a discrete area, geographic area, it proposes that there is a relationship between the nations and economies and lives of populations living in these two areas of the world. Susan and I talked earlier, and we do have a resource or a short bibliography of sources, some of the sources that I'm drawing from today for my talk, and that will be available to all of you. But this slide basically features some of the key texts that transnational, in the field of transnational feminism, but we can come back to that. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time then talking about violence, victimization, agency, and how campaigns around gender-based violence in the global South enter the conversations of global feminism. And again, here I want to emphasize the idea of location, that we are talking about gender-based violence from a North American context, and I'm particularly interested in how campaigns around anti-violence work and gender-based violence in the Global South enter the conversations in the global North, or this discourse of global feminism, and what are some of its consequences. So I draw from the work of Paul Farmer, who talks about the mechanisms through which certain forms of social inequality, like poverty and racism and sexism, become embodied as individual experience of extreme violence and suffering. So it is sort of a methodology that he offers, which I find very useful, that if we are to study the life narratives or the trajectory of certain individuals, what would we learn about suffering and gendered vulnerability, as opposed to thinking about gender-based violence as a singular act. So if we look at sort of a broader spectrum in somebody's life history, how would that enable us to understand the specific kinds of suffering he or she might experience? This slide here shows sort of a global spread of violence against women, particularly intimate partner violence during their lifetime. And as Susan mentioned earlier on in the introduction, that gender-based violence is a worldwide global phenomenon. It is not necessarily confined to any one part of the world. And this is sort of a visual image of the pervasiveness of violence against women. And also, it's important to think about the domestic violence and violence against women in general in the context of the United States, since we are talking about location and the first world, third world binary, and how often when conversations around violence against women take place, it assumes that there is a certain type of culture of violence that exists in certain regions of the world, and how we tend to think about violence against women in the United States in terms of individual cases. So I think the statistics provided here are really stark in the sense that they help us see that how pervasive it is in the culture of the United States itself. So if you see that 1 in 4 U.S. women are victims of domestic violence, that U.S. women who are murdered by their partners every day, 3 U.S. women who have survived attempted or completed sexual assault, 1 in 6. I think there is statistic out there that tells us that 1 in 4 young women in college campuses experience sexual violence. So it's the numbers are staggering. So this is just something to keep in mind. So how does bodies like the United Nations define violence against women? The UN Declaration states that any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life, is understood as violence against women. So just a word here that this is a very useful definition because it sort of talks about violence in the physical realm, in the sexual realm, but also on the psychological realm, and it also talks about violence in the public as well as private sphere. So all of these aspects of violence is something that has been much fought for in the activist arena for recognition. So this idea that violence in the private space is actually a form, is a crime. It's not something that has always been given. So all of these attributes to this definition are long and hard fought for achievements, I would say, for various activist movements. Yet we also have to think here that there are ways that this definition of violence is also limiting, because it does sort of imply or confine the idea of violence to physical injury and not so much to structural violence, which is a concept that we'll be talking more about as we move forward with the presentation. And another major critique of this definition of violence against women also has been that it is somewhat narrow, that in the sense that women also, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, don't experience their lives only on the basis of gender. So there are these other identity axes and such as caste and class and sexuality, which complicates the experience of violence for women as well as men. So this definition, while it is very useful and broad and hard fought for, is also somewhat limiting in some ways when organizing against gender-based violence in very different contexts. Another useful tool for organizing around gender-based violence is, of course, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1979, I believe, and it lists an area of 30, it includes 30 different articles and ways in which that discrimination against women can be recognized and responded to and treated by UN signatory states, and we should take a moment here to mention that the United States is one of the very, very few member countries of the United Nations that actually hasn't ratified the UN CEDAW yet. In addition to the UN CEDAW, there are also the various UN Women's Conferences, starting from Nairobi in 1975 to Mexico to Copenhagen to the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, which resulted in the Beijing Platform of Action, which is another extremely important instrument of human rights organizing globally. And the Beijing Platform of Action, which was formulated in 1995, actually put violence against women squarely on the agenda, and it brought unprecedented attention to violence against women. The Platform of Action listed 12 critical areas, including violence against women, which needs state-level intervention, and outlined mechanisms through which civil society organizations and legal organizations can put pressure on their governments to introduce legislation and various other ways to respond to gender-based violence. So together, the UN CEDAW, the Beijing Platform of Action, and all of these norms and instruments that have come afterwards, like the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and you can look up all of these in the UN websites, present some really critical areas and resources for activists. However, there is also a cautionary note here, as legal scholar Makao Mutua tells us that the use of international human rights instruments are somewhat problematic because the ways that these are formulated actually go back to the ways in which in the period of the colonial administrative era, nation states were seen as such that certain areas of the world were more civilized than others, and these kinds of racial grammar, as she calls it, has seeped into the language of human rights instruments. So at the one hand, they present us with very useful tools. On the other hand, they also, in the ways in which who gets to formulate these policies, who has most of the access and the resources, that these are very uneven. And she says that it almost resembles this three-pronged metaphor of the savage victim savior, where particularly in the area of violence against women, it is always spectacular forms of violences that are occurring in the global south that get named as violence, and these are usually understood as violence that women are experiencing in the hands of their culture, their men, and their states, so that they are the victim, and their culture and the state are the savages, and the men are the savages, and then Western human rights organizations and states appear as the savior figure in this equation. And we can name any number of instances historically, and just most recently, I would just refer to the various recent wars that the United States has been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, where saving women has been used as sort of a justification for war and invasion and occupation, leading to the deterioration of women's well-being on the ground. So this kind of savage victim savior narrative is very much part of the instruments of human rights, which on the one hand help bolster various campaigns against gender-based oppression, but on the other hand can also serve as instruments of continued oppression. We have some images here of various campaigns around the world addressing gender-based violence. And now I would like to turn to a few of the case studies from South Asia, which is my regional focus of research, and I'll be talking in particular about Bangladesh, which is sort of to the east of the map in purple, and also Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is on the northwest, and these are part of the South Asian region. The first narrative that I would just like to talk a little bit about is Malala Yousufzai of Pakistan. And of course, I think many of you are probably familiar with her story, that she was, of course, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just about a year ago for her activism around girls' education. When she was 15 years old, she was shot and wounded by the Pakistani Taliban. This happened in 2012 when she was just 15. and she later on came to UK for treatment and continues to live and work and study in the UK. The reason that I chose this particular narrative is, of course, because this is a very popular and important narrative in the contemporary context when we are talking about spectacular violence or global feminism organizing. Some of the less talked about parts of her story is how even before Malala came to the UK and won all of these awards, she had been an activist in Pakistan for girls' education for a very long time. She was writing a blog for the BBC. She comes from a family where her father is also himself a prominent activist and educator in the Swat Valley, which is a Taliban stronghold, and in fact has struggled his entire life to set up various kinds of educational avenues for girls, and how this particular story of Malala projects her as sort of a individual heroine battling the Taliban and living to tell the tale, whereas the very precarious conditions that led to the shooting of Malala and some of her friends on the school bus in October 2012 can also be explained through the lens of war and imperialism and colonization, that it's a particular region of the world that bordering Afghanistan that has seen war after war after war and devastation, and how those conditions have created a particular kind of marginalization for that community and gender-based vulnerability for Muslim men and women. So these are the kinds of stories that often don't get told when we engage with the story of Malala. While this is an extraordinary story, she is often projected as an exceptional heroine, almost, battling Islamic extremists, whereas various Pakistani feminist scholars have pointed out that that there are many activists who are working on the ground in very dangerous conditions, and these are often not recognized in the global arena when we talk about women's activism. Now, there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention in relation to Malala's story that that interestingly also in October 2012, a U.S. drone strike killed several members of a family, and one of the survivors in the same region that Malala Yousufzai comes from, and a young girl, Nabila, who is a survivor of that U.S. drone attack, traveled to the United States to give testimony of that incident, and her story almost is invisible in the media, whereas Malala's story is seen as exceptional as a young girl fighting the Muslim terrorists and the Islamic extremists. On the other hand, Nabila's story gets no attention or little attention, whereas she is protesting the U.S. Drone attacks, which is also creating all kinds of vulnerable conditions for the populations living in that region. The second story I wanted to focus a little bit on is a story of a young woman called Dena from Bangladesh, who was attacked by a young man in her neighborhood called Dena, and she is a victim of acid violence, which is a form of gender-based violence. South Asia particularly has a high prevalence of acid attacks against women and girls. And I bring attention to this story is if we think about what Paul Farmer suggests, that is following the life trajectory of an individual and what can be learned through that, we see that Dena is a young woman who grew up in northern part of Bangladesh. She came from a middle-class family. Her father left her and her mother and her two young siblings, and they moved in with their mother's brother's family. Her mother's brother went off to the Middle East as a labor migrant, which is a very common scenario in various South Asian countries. Very heavy labor migration occurs between South Asia to the Middle Eastern countries. Now, it's a very precarious kind of labor because one can be hired and let go without so much of a notice. Governments have certain quotas that allow certain countries to participate in labor migration and not others, and that changes in a whimsical basis. When Dena's uncle lost his job in the Middle East, he returned and moved the family to the capital city of Dhaka in search of work, and they moved into this apartment in a part of the city which is located very close to a leather factory. And this is relevant because as more and more industrialization is occurring in across South Asia, various businesses like leather factories, auto mechanic stores use acid, hydrochloric sulfuric acid, which are sold and purchased without proper regulation. And this particular young man acquired the acid from this leather factory, came and attacked Dena in the middle of the night. And acid violence cases, the causes are often the rejection of romantic advances from men, or dispute over property, family disputes, community disputes, but women are disproportionately targeted. Now, Dena and her cousin had rejected the advances of this young man, and as a result, he came and attacked them. And there was a powerful politician in that neighborhood who gave shelter to Dena so that he wasn't even properly prosecuted. So I tell you this story so that this idea of acid attack being a singular act of violence can be demystified. So we can see how the family itself was an economic migrant to the city, lived in an area that was not particularly secure or safe, that even when the attack occurred, the perpetrator here was never prosecuted because they were given political shelter by powerful men in the neighborhood, so that a number of factors like political conflict and economic exploitation created the conditions of vulnerability for an individual like Dena. I want to say a few words about the case number 3 here, which is many of you probably are familiar with, that in December 2012, there was a particular gang rape case in Delhi on a moving bus against a young woman who later died from these injuries. There were 6 men involved, and they were all working class migrants to Delhi, and the young woman who was attacked was a medical student, and also coming from a rural working class background, but aspiring middle class aspirations. And this sort of created a lot of uproar and protest and activist responses in India, and as a result of this particular case and the sort of the unprecedented levels of mobilization that we saw, a committee was set up to look into archaic laws around rape and gender-based violence, and some of these were revised, and new legislation was passed. The ways in which that the story was covered in the Western media, however, was very problematic because it portrayed India as a sort of a very violent, backward culture where gender-based violence was pervasive, and that the men who committed this gang rape were seen as sort of particularly prone to violence because of poverty and their backwards lifestyle. So it created a number of responses from the feminist community, and one of them was a film that was made about this campaign called India's Daughter by a British filmmaker, where some of the men who committed the crime were interviewed, and the lawyers who were representing them were interviewed and were projected in a very sort of stereotypical ways where they said very misogynist things, sort of reifying the ways in which that this whole idea of death by culture, or India being particularly prone to gender-based violence, gets sort of reasserted. So I think, at the same time we saw various rape cases being reported in the United States. There was one involving a young woman in Ohio, for instance, also a gang rape that was talked about in very different ways. So this idea of culture as an alibi to the violence was certainly not used in that context. And of course, the tremendous activism of Indian feminists and civil society that led to the change of legislation and the various protests, all of which has a long democratic history in the Indian subcontinent, is also something that we need to add to the mix. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the case study of Rana Plaza, which some of you also may be familiar with. This occurred in April of 2013. Some of you may know that Bangladesh is the #2 supplier of garments to the global market, trailing China, that it is almost a $20 billion annually industry, that most of the workers who work in this industry, some close to 4 million workers, are employed in garment factories. Most of them are women. In 2013, one of the buildings which housed several garment factories in Savar, which is north of the capital city of Dhaka, collapsed, killing upwards of 1,100 workers, again mostly women. And what was later found out was that the building had been declared unsafe by building inspectors. However, the factory owners had insisted that the workers go in and work, otherwise they were not going to get paid. So there's a real sort of treatment of garment industry workers as second-class citizens here, and it sort of shook the world into taking notice of the very unjust conditions of work and the ways in which the government and the various retail companies and trade bodies that actually come up with the various policies about international trade had not been accountable to the suffering of workers. Now, the garment industry workers are often seen as emancipated women in the context of Bangladesh because they're income earners and they're contributing to the economic solvency of their families, and they're becoming more and more financially independent and agents under capitalist economies. However, I also want to talk about the gender-based violence in the context of this corporate patriarchy. So while if you go back to the definition of the UN definition of violence against women, and I mentioned that it is very individualistic, that it doesn't certainly have room to talk about gender-based violence in the context of the capitalist economy. So while patriarchy in the family context or male to female violence is recognized within that definition, the patriarchy of corporations and multinational corporations that leads to this kinds of industrial disasters that kill women workers is not recognized within that definition of violence against women. But I would argue that both are instances of violence against women, and that we need to think about structural violence, which is systems of racism, systems of globalization, capitalism, how these as structures, as systems, create conditions through which women in particular, and also poor men, are particularly vulnerable to violence. So I am almost at the end of my presentation.
That's wonderful,
but
Laura.
I
just
wanted
to say that Elora is going to be wrapping up in a moment. Your talk was riveting, and you've given us hours and hours worth of content to think about. If those of you who are listening have some questions that you want to begin formulating and putting into the chat box, we welcome those. And Elora, we'd love to hear your closing thoughts, and then we'll have a chance for some conversation. Thank you so much.
Sure. So, just as a closing thought, I have a quote here from feminist scholar Judith Butler, who talks about this concept of precarity, which is basically a systematic inequality that make certain populations particularly prone to suffering and harm and violence. And these are embedded in our political and social and economic systems. And so to think about gender-based violence not only through the lens of individual harm and bodily injury as a result of male-to-female violence, but also through these larger systematic and structural ways. And finally, I wanted to end with, again, many of you may be familiar with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is a novelist from Nigeria, and she has this wonderful TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. If you have a chance to see it, it's really instructive because she talks about how in her particular context, stories about Nigerian women or African women are often presented as a single story of oppression and backwardness in the context of the Western world. And similarly, when we think about violence against women in the global South, they often appear to us as those singular, spectacular, violent stories. But there is always another side to that story. There are always more complexities and nuances to that story, which I think that paying attention to historical and structural inequalities as they are still pervading in our thought systems, but also in various economies and political systems through which we interact with each other. Paying attention to those will probably give us a more holistic picture and make our responses to gender-based violence more ethical and accountable. So I think I will end there, and I would love to talk more.
Elora, thank you. We're giving you a virtual round of applause for that really just so cogent and thought-provoking presentation, and making the connections between structural violence and linking that with the discourse of gender violence is just so really moving us in new directions. I have to say that was very eye-opening and a wonderful presentation. So thank you so much for all that you shared and the clarity with which you shared those really complicated topics. If anyone would like to ask your question or make a comment by speaking, you feel free to use the little raised hand button and raise your hand, and we'll give you the microphone. And if you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us about narratives that you've worked with your students that have, or stories that you've told or found effective with your students in terms of exploring gender violence, it would be interesting to hear those. Whether you're thinking about some of those stories in different ways would be very interesting to know too. Elora, I'm curious about the term precarity is new for me. Is that related to precarious, people who are in a precarious situation, or do you know?
Yes, I believe so. I think it is related to that term, and Butler uses that in a way to talk about systematic vulnerability. Basically, that certain populations are living in more precarious conditions.
Yeah, very good. I'm wondering if you saw the film He Made Me Malala, He Called Me Malala, the film that was released this summer. I have not myself had a chance to see it, but I wonder what your reflections are on it. It will certainly shape, I think, the way that many people think about that story, because film is so powerful. Did you like it, or
I did see it, and I've taught the book in my class, and I saw the film, and I think that I was it's a very beautifully done film, but what my concern was that the film was really devoid of any politics. So some of the historical experiences of war and imperialism and how that contributed to the vulnerability of the population in Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and also to the creation of the Taliban itself, was really completely left out of the film. And I was fortunate enough to attend the opening session in Cambridge, where the director was present, and somebody in the audience actually asked him that question, and his response was that he wanted to humanize the story, and that he believed that politics sometimes dehumanizes. So, you know, I wanted to think about that more, because I think you know, some of the more, I mean, Malala's story is extremely powerful, and that came out in a very powerful way. But, you know, some of those inequities, I think, that are so important were not part of the story.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. Yes. So a couple of questions are coming up about education. Thank you, Sarah, for asking that great question. So there's the assertion that education of women is, and raising the level of education of women in society is an effective way to help eradicate violence. And we wonder what thoughts you have about that assertion, and then about what kind of influence can be placed on UN bodies and the U.S. government to promote and to support education for women as a tool of greater gender equality.
Right. I think education is a very important tool towards women's empowerment and emancipation, and all of the UN policies that I referred to actually identify education as one critical area of intervention, of concern, of mobilization. So it is something that I think is very much at the forefront. Some of the ways that I think activists talk about education and perhaps its limits in a way are that, so I can talk to you about the example of Bangladesh, where at this point there is 100% girls enrollment in primary school. Mm-hmm. That has been achieved through various state level and non-state level organizational work and commitment. However, some of the research points to that, what are the values and ideas that are being transmitted through the education system, and are there gender biases within the education materials, and also the pathways of education, that access to education and moving up to secondary and higher education. What are some of the barriers for men versus women, or girls versus boys to attend school? I was just recently actually reading a report on the condition of Dalits, which are the lowest caste population in India. Mm-hmm. And this report was looking at sort of the very sort of problematic numbers as in relation to Dalit communities attending school, doing well in school, and then getting employment once they're out of school. And at almost every level, there were so many hidden, or what I would perceive to, the elite community hidden. It's obviously not hidden if you're a Dalit yourself. Mm-hmm. Barriers that are not recognized. So, for instance, the distance that one has to travel to go to a good school, and how for girls in particular that traveling 2 hours each way by bus means that they almost have no way of participating in any kind of extra class tutoring sessions, because they have to get back home before it's dark. They're missing out on all kinds of opportunities that are provided outside the classroom, because they're just not able to avail those opportunities. How even when they're in the classroom, that the teachers tend to say that in a very derogatory way to the Dalit students, that why are you even in school? You should be out working in the fields. So from the mindset to sort of the direct and not so direct ways that this community is discriminated against, that even if education is made available and it is freely available, that there are so many obstacles that we need to sort of pay attention to. And I think this is where the whole idea of intersectionality is very important, that it's not simply that girls' education, it's also we are talking about different communities of girls, right? The Dalits or the extremely poor communities, and how to sort of address all of these different communities in an effective way.
Nice. Yes, that's great. And a nice comment was shared at the bottom comment question that relates to political empowerment, also giving a voice to women who can then women and lower class and in all of these marginalized communities that will also impact the kinds of policies that are formulated. I want to just take in our last few minutes together, I want to take a moment to introduce you to our brand new resource guide on gender violence in a global context. And so just so that you can find it yourself and know what's there and what kind of opportunities it might represent for you and your students. And there's a screenshot here of the resource guide. And so I'll just show that to you, and I'm going to show you highlight a few of the links from this guide. But I think Stephanie's going to take a moment here to put the live link into the chat box. So if you want to pull that up yourself, you can get access to it and look at it on your own. So after the webinar, and we'll come back to you, Elora, just at the end to sign off. And if you have any final comments, we'd love to have you share those as well. So as I mentioned before, this resource guide was curated by our staff librarian at Primary Source, and we're very grateful to her for doing such a lovely job with that. Many of these materials are classroom ready and usable in the classroom, and others are great background resources for students and teachers, which we hope that you'll explore for global studies courses, for student research projects, National History Day projects. Sometimes students are interested in global women's equality issues, Women's History Month projects, and also co-curricular social justice student groups have had a great deal of interest in the topic of gender violence and may want to educate themselves and their peers on this important topic. You'll see in the left-hand column of the resource guide that we have a set of books that we recommend. One of them is Elora's book, which is linked there, and then Nick Kristof and Cheryl Wudun's Half the Sky is probably very familiar to many of you. So speaking of that team of Kristof and Wudun, one of the resources that I wanted to take a moment to highlight is the film A Path Appears. This is a 3-part documentary series from PBS Independent Lens. And the filmmakers here teamed up with Nick Kristof and his collaborator Cheryl Wudun to examine the ripple effects of gender inequality in 4 societies: Colombia, Haiti, Kenya, and the U.S. And the series focuses in particular on ground-level grassroots solutions that women and some men are devising to address these problems in their own societies. So it links very nicely to Elora's interest in activism on the local level and what people are doing in a very intersectional way, I think, to address some of these problems. There's a good teacher resource guide on PBS Learning Media that we wanted to call your attention to accompany the film series, and this is an image from that resource, which includes some short and not so short, some of them video segments with discussion questions and lesson plans. Also under curriculum resources on our study guide is something quite wonderful called the Change Makers, which is a set of peer training modules for young people to train other young people about the topics of gender equality, violence, and healthy relationships. The modules are really well done with great engaging activities for adolescents and teens, and this resource was created out of the UN Asia Pacific Regional Office. So I think many of those lessons are interesting and adaptable by student groups. I'm going to skip over this nice reading under the articles column. There's I love the website Together for Girls, which sponsors a really good digital magazine about ending violence, and the readings are really very accessible for young people. So there's some heroes and heroines in that section that you can look into with good informational text. And then to go back to our resource guide, I finally want to mention that Karen has added to the resource guide in this bottom box websites of advocacy groups. Some of them, many of them grassroots organizations working for change globally, and these I think are good links for student action projects or student research projects. One example of such an organization that's highlighted here is an interesting organization that has a Boston and India connection. DAWN, the Direct Action for Women Now, is an organization that involves women working in the Boston area with women in and girls, boys and men as well in India, and they're doing some exciting work in educating boys and young women. So I urge you to check that out. And finally, we have links here that can help your school transform Valentine's Day into V-Day, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a worldwide campaign to end violence against women. You may have heard of the 1 Billion Rising group, which is inspired by activist and playwright Eve Ensler, who's also a violence survivor herself. So this group is her brainchild. And we have listed here both 1 Billion Rising and the V-Day campaign. That might be a good set of resources for you to check out for your school as well. So we are very close. We're past time, actually, so we should be signing off. Elora, thank you so much. Was there anything you'd like to
my
leave us with
pleasure.
a final thought or comment?
Just thank you for having me, and if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to respond by email, and my information is on my website on UMass Boston.
Thank you so much. You've been such a wonderful supporter of our work with teachers at Primary Source, and we look forward to working with you further in the future. I can see we need a whole course on understanding gender violence in a global context, so watch for that in the future. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Here are some ways you can stay connected with us, and we look forward to seeing you, we hope, for our third webinar on global social justice on children's rights coming up in early May. So thank you all. Everyone get home dry and safe if you're in the Boston area, and we wish you a good rest of the school year, and we'll be in touch. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.